Hello, welcome to Prajim Technologies. I am Venkat. This is part 42 of SQL Server. In this session, we'll learn about view limitations. Before continuing with this session, I strongly recommend to watch parts 39, 40 and 41 of this video series. You cannot pass parameters to a view. Let's understand what we mean by this with an example. Let's flip back to SQL Server Management Studio. I have a table called TBL employee, which has got ID name, salary, gender and department ID columns. Now let's create a view on this table. So here we are creating a view called view employee details, and this view is returning all the columns except the salary column from TBL employee. So it's returning ID name, gender and department ID columns. Alright, let's create that view. So create view employee details as select ID name, gender, department ID from TBL employee. Execute, command completed successfully, refresh the views folder, and we should be seeing the view there. Alright, to select the data from the view, select star from that view name. We get the data back, which is good. Okay, now let's try to pass a parameter to this view and see what actually happens. If you look at the view implementation on the right with a red cross on it, the difference between these two views is that in the view here, we are actually passing in a gender parameter of type nvarchar. And we are using that parameter to filter the rows from TBL employee table. So in the where clause we are saying where gender is equal to at gender, the parameter that we pass in. Now is this possible in views? It's not possible. You cannot pass parameters to views. That's why it's crossed out. Now what will happen when we try to do that? We will get an error. So it's not possible to pass parameters to a view. In the sense we cannot create parameterized views. Okay, so let's try to do that and see what actually happens. So create view, execute, and we get an error. Okay, so parameterized views cannot be created. Now if you really want, the reason why we are passing in here gender parameter is I want to filter based on the gender. So if you want to do that, you can actually use the where clause if you want to. Let's say for example if you say select star from that view, you get all the employees, and just in case I want only male employees, I can use the where clause where gender is equal to male, and I only get male employees. On the other hand, if you want female, you can filter so. Alright, or what else you can do, you can actually use table valued function as a replacement for parameterized views. In fact, we have spoken about that when we were discussing about functions. Okay, so let us see how to create a function that can act as a replacement for a parameterized view. So if you look at here, we have an inline table valued function called fn employee details. So create function name. Again, if you're new to functions, we have already spoken about functions in a very great detail in the previous sessions of this video series. So create function name, and this function is taking in a parameter called @gender of type nvarchar, which returns a table. And if you look at the implementation, this is a very simple function which selects ID name, gender, department ID from TBL employee, filtering the rows based on the gender using the parameter that we are passing into this function. Okay, so this is an inline table valued function which is also taking a parameter, and the way we invoke the function, look at this, it's exactly the same way as we invoke a view. So select star from this function name and we pass it the parameter that it expects, in this case gender, male or female. So now we are able to filter the rows using a parameter. So you can use this inline table valued function as a replacement for a parameterized view in SQL Server, because in SQL Server it's not possible to pass parameters to views. And remember, to invoke a table valued function you have to use the two-part name dbo dot the function name. Alright, so let's create this function and select data from that. So here is the function create fn employee details. So if we expand programmability functions, since this is a table valued function, we already have the function, so let's delete that and then recreate it. So execute the statement. Command completed successfully. That's a function is created now. So select star from that function, passing in mail, and we only get mail records. Okay, so parameterized views cannot be created in SQL Server, but table valued functions can be used as a replacement. Okay, rules and defaults cannot be associated with views. So this is another limitation that views have, and it makes sense because views are virtual tables. They don't really store any data except for indexed views. That's why it makes sense not to have rules and defaults being associated with a view. And the order by clause is invalid in view unless top or for XML is also specified. So in a view definition, you cannot use the order by clause. Let's try to use an order by clause in this view and see what actually happens. So Alt view, select from this table, and let's say we want to order the results by ID, and let's see what happens. So execute. So we get the same error message. The order by clause is invalid in views, inline functions, and derived tables, subqueries, and CTE, common table expressions, unless top or for XML is also specified. So you cannot use the order by clause unless you use the top or for XML keywords. Okay, views cannot be based on temporary tables. This is another interesting limitation. Let's look at that in action. So we have a temporary table called #test temp table, and this is a simple temporary table that has got ID, name, and gender columns, and we are inserting some sample data into that temporary table. Again, we have spoken about local temporary tables and global temporary tables in a great detail in a previous session. So if you're new to temporary tables, I strongly recommend watching those videos first. Okay, so create the temporary table, insert some sample data into that temporary table. Now let's create a view on that temporary table. So create view name as, and if you look at the implementation of the view, we are selecting the ID, name, and gender columns from that temporary table. The fact that it has ## within that table name, it makes it a temporary table. So obviously, is this possible? Can you create a view on temporary tables? You cannot. If you try to do that, you will get an error message stating so. Let's try to see that in action. So we have this create table, #test temp table, ID, name, and gender. ID is of type integer, name and gender are nvarchar. Let's try to create this table. Let's see if there is this temporary table already created. So drop table, F5. Alright, so now let's go ahead and create this table. Press F5, so the command completed. Since this is a global temporary table, we can access it in any session of the SQL Server. So let's try to insert some data into that. F5. Alright, let's quickly check if the data exists in in the temporary table. Select star from the temporary table name. So we have the data. Very good. Now let's try to create a view on this temporary table. The creation of the view itself is very simple. It's almost very identical to how we create view on a regular concrete table, on a permanent table, except that we specify the global temporary, the temporary table name here. So create view name as, select whatever columns you want from that temporary table. Let's try to create this and see what actually happens. So execute, and we get the same error message that we are expecting. Views or functions are not allowed on temporary tables. Table names that begin with # denote temporary tables. Single hash is a local temporary table, and double hash is a global temporary table. So you cannot create views or functions on temporary tables. Okay, so those are the limitations on views. You cannot pass parameters to a view. Rules and defaults cannot be associated with views. The order by clause is invalid in views unless top or for XML keywords are also specified. Views cannot be based on temporary tables. On this slide, you can find resources for ASP.NET C Sharp and SQL Server interview questions. If you want to receive email alerts when new videos are posted, please subscribe to my channel. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.